I paid over $15,000 to help fund my brother's wedding. Then at the reception, his bride said, "You can't sit with the family, so you don't ruin the photos." So I stepped outside, called the venue manager, and canceled the remaining balance. 30 minutes later, the lights went out and the staff started packing up in the middle of their first dance. I, 32M, never thought I'd be writing this, but here we are. 6 months ago, my life imploded in the most spectacular way possible, and I'm still processing what happened at what should have been my brother's happiest day. Let me start from the beginning. My brother and I had always been close growing up. After our parents died in a car accident when I was 25 and he was 22, we only had each other. I'd built up a decent consulting business over the years, while he struggled to find his footing career-wise. When he met his fiancée 2 years ago, I was genuinely happy for him. She seemed nice enough at first, though I noticed she had expensive tastes and wasn't shy about expressing them. The trouble started when they announced their engagement last year. They wanted this massive wedding at an upscale venue downtown, the kind of place that charges 5 figures just for the reception hall. My brother pulled me aside one evening and explained their situation. Between student loans and his entry-level marketing job, they couldn't afford the wedding they wanted. His fiancée had her heart set on this particular venue, and the deposit alone was crushing them financially. I remember sitting in his cramped apartment, watching him fidget with his hands as he asked if I could help with some of the costs. He seemed genuinely embarrassed, kept saying he'd pay me back once his career took off. This was my little brother, the same kid I'd helped through college after our parents died. Of course I was going to help. What started as contributing a few thousand quickly snowballed. The venue required payment in installments, and somehow I found myself covering more and more of their expenses. First it was the reception hall, then the catering, then the flowers because the ones they originally picked weren't good enough. His fiancée kept mentioning how her friends would judge them if certain details weren't perfect. By the time the wedding rolled around 3 weeks ago, I'd paid over $15,000. That represented most of my savings and a significant chunk of what I'd set aside for expanding my business. But seeing my brother happy felt worth it. He was practically glowing during the ceremony, and for those few hours, I felt good about my decision. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Small church, intimate setting, maybe 60 guests total. I sat in the second row with my brother's college roommate and his girlfriend. Everything felt normal, familial, exactly what I'd hoped for. After the ceremony, we all headed to the reception venue. This gorgeous ballroom with crystal chandeliers and panoramic city views. That's where things went sideways. I just walked into the reception hall, still wearing my best suit and the boutonniere my brother had specifically asked me to wear as his honorary groomsman. The cocktail hour was in full swing, and I was looking forward to finally relaxing and celebrating. I approached the main table where the wedding party and immediate family were supposed to sit. The same table I'd been told I'd have a seat at since I was the closest thing to family my brother had left. His new wife intercepted me before I could reach the table. She was radiant in her designer dress, another expense I'd partially funded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes as she approached me. She told me there had been a change in the seating arrangements. Apparently, they needed to keep the head table clean for photos, and having me there would throw off the aesthetic they were going for. She explained that they'd put me at a table in the back with some of her work colleagues who I didn't know. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I was hearing. This was the same woman who'd called me 3 months earlier, crying about how much my generosity meant to both of them. The same person who'd sent me handwritten thank you notes after each payment I'd made toward their dream wedding. I asked her if my brother knew about this seating change. She waved her hand dismissively and said he was busy with photos and she was handling all the reception details. She assured me he'd understand. After all, the photos were forever, and they needed them to look perfect. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't family in her eyes. I was just the wallet that had made all this possible, and now that the checks had cleared, I was an inconvenience to be managed. I looked over at my brother, who was indeed occupied with the photographer, completely oblivious to what was happening. Part of me wanted to march over there and create a scene, but something held me back. Maybe it was years of conflict avoidance, or maybe I wanted to see how far this would go. Instead, I told her I needed some air and stepped outside onto the venue's terrace. The sun was setting over the city, painting everything in golden light. Inside, I could hear laughter and music starting up. It should have been one of the happiest moments of my life, celebrating my brother's new chapter. Instead, I felt hollow and used. That's when I remembered something crucial: the venue's payment schedule. The final balance of $8,000 wasn't due until the end of the reception. I'd arranged to pay it directly to avoid any last-minute stress for my brother, and the venue manager had my credit card on file for automatic payment at midnight. I pulled out my phone and called the venue's main number. It took a few transfers, but I eventually reached Marcus, the event coordinator who'd been handling their wedding. He was surprised to hear from me during the reception, but I explained that I needed to cancel the remaining payment immediately. Marcus seemed confused at first. He asked if there was a problem with the service or if something had gone wrong. I kept it simple. I told him I was no longer authorizing payment for the remaining balance and needed my card removed from their system immediately. He explained that canceling payment would mean shutting down the reception, since they required full payment before the end of the evening. The music, lighting, bar service, everything would stop once they realized payment wasn't coming through. I asked him how long it would take to process the cancellation. He said about 30 minutes for their system to update and notify the on-site staff. I thanked him and hung up. For those 30 minutes, I stood on that terrace watching through the windows as the reception continued inside. My brother and his new wife had their first dance to some romantic ballad while guests swayed nearby with drinks in hand. The photographer captured every moment, those perfect shots that were apparently too important to include the brother who'd made it all possible. I kept checking my watch. 25 minutes, 28 minutes, 30 minutes. Right on schedule, I watched the lighting shift inside. The warm ambient lights flickered once, then switched to harsh overhead fluorescence. The music cut out mid-song, leaving my brother and his wife frozen in the middle of the dance floor looking confused. Staff members started appearing from various directions, and I could see Marcus talking urgently to the bartender. Within minutes, they were packing up the bar, wrapping equipment, and clearing tables. The guests looked around bewildered as the magical atmosphere evaporated in real time. I watched my brother approach Marcus, gesturing frantically. Even from outside, I could see the panic spreading across his face as the situation was explained to him. His wife stood beside him, her perfect makeup starting to run as the reality of what was happening sank in. That's when my brother spotted me through the window. Our eyes met across the suddenly chaotic reception hall, and I saw the exact moment he understood what had happened. Not the details, maybe, but the general outline. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, hurt, and finally something that looked like resignation. I wasn't proud of what I felt in that moment. There was satisfaction, sure, but also a deep sadness that it had come to this. This wasn't how I'd imagined my brother's wedding day ending. My phone started buzzing with calls, first from my brother, then from his wife, then from random numbers I assumed were other wedding guests. I let them all go to voicemail. Whatever conversations needed to happen could wait until emotions cooled down. I left the venue and drove home, still wearing my boutonniere and carrying a strange mix of vindication and regret. The silence in my apartment felt deafening after the chaos I'd just witnessed. Update 1. The calls and messages started that same night and haven't stopped since. My brother left 6 voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. In the first few, he was angry, demanding to know why I'd sabotaged his wedding. By the 4th call, his tone had shifted to pleading, asking me to call him back so we could work things out. His wife sent a series of increasingly unhinged text messages. She started by calling me petty and vindictive, then moved on to detailing how I'd ruined the most important day of her life. Her final message, sent at 3 in the morning, was a long rambling thing about how I was jealous of their happiness and couldn't stand to see my brother move on with his life. I didn't respond to any of them that first week. I needed time to process what had happened and figure out how I felt about the whole situation. The truth is, I felt terrible about how the evening had ended, but I also felt justified in my actions. Being treated like an unwanted charity case at an event I'd largely funded crossed a line I didn't even know I had. The story apparently spread quickly through their friend group and her family. I started getting calls from people I barely knew, some supporting my decision and others condemning it. Her mother left a particularly nasty voicemail calling me selfish and cruel. A few of my brother's college friends reached out to say they'd been uncomfortable with how I'd been treated that night. About 10 days after the wedding, my brother showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't answer the door, but something about his persistence made me relent. He looked terrible, exhausted and hollow-eyed in a way that reminded me of how we'd both looked in the months after our parents died. He asked if we could talk, and I let him in. We sat in my living room, the same place where he'd first asked for help with the wedding expenses, and the irony wasn't lost on either of us. He started by apologizing, which caught me off guard. He said he hadn't known about the seating arrangement until it was too late, and by then the damage was done. He'd spent the days since the wedding trying to understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly. I told him about my conversation with his wife, about being relegated to the back of the room like some distant acquaintance rather than family. He listened without interrupting, and I could see him processing the full scope of what had happened. He admitted that there had been other incidents during the wedding planning that should have been red flags. Times when his wife had made dismissive comments about my contributions or suggested that I was being overly involved in their wedding. He'd brushed off these comments as pre-wedding stress, but now he was seeing them in a different light. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. We talked about our parents, about how we'd relied on each other after they died, about the expectations and pressures that had built up around this wedding. He acknowledged that he'd let me down as a brother, not just that night, but throughout the wedding planning process. I told him I wasn't proud of how I'd handled the situation. Shutting down his reception had been a nuclear option, and while I stood by the decision, I wished there had been another way to make my point. By the end of our conversation, we'd reached something like an understanding. The relationship was damaged, but maybe not beyond repair. He asked if I wanted the money back, and I told him that wasn't the point. It never had been about the money. Update 2. Things got more complicated over the following weeks. My brother's marriage was clearly struggling under the weight of what had happened. According to mutual friends, there had been several arguments about the whole situation, with each spouse blaming the other for how things had escalated. His wife had apparently expected him to cut me off completely after the wedding incident. When he refused and actually defended my actions to some degree, it created a rift between them that seemed to be widening by the day. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own fallout. Word of what had happened had spread through our extended social circle, and people had strong opinions about my actions. Some saw it as justified revenge against someone who had used and disrespected me. Others viewed it as a cruel overreaction that had damaged my relationship with my brother possibly beyond repair. I started seeing a therapist to help process everything that had happened. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my reaction to the wedding situation was about more than just that one evening. It was tied up in years of being the responsible older brother, the one who fixed problems and provided support without asking for anything in return. She pointed out that I'd been putting myself in that role since our parents died, and my brother had become comfortable letting me handle things while he focused on his own life. The wedding situation had been the culmination of years of this dynamic playing out. About a month after the wedding, I got an unexpected call from my brother's wife. She was crying and apologetic in a way that seemed genuinely remorseful rather than manipulative. She asked if we could meet for coffee to talk through what had happened. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a neutral location downtown, and she looked as rough as my brother had when he'd come to my apartment. The stress of the past few weeks was clearly taking its toll on their marriage. She apologized for how she'd treated me at the reception and admitted that she'd been so focused on having the perfect wedding that she'd lost sight of what was really important. She said she'd grown up in a family where appearances mattered more than relationships, and she'd carried that mindset into her marriage without realizing it. I appreciated the apology, but I was honest with her about the fact that trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. The way she dismissed me that night had revealed something about her character that couldn't be easily forgotten. She asked what it would take to repair our relationship, and I told her I needed to see consistent change over time, not just words. If she was serious about making amends, it would have to be demonstrated through actions. Update 3. It's been 3 months since the wedding now, and things have settled into an uneasy new normal. My brother and I have been slowly rebuilding our relationship through regular conversations and family therapy sessions. It's been helpful to have a neutral space to work through the hurt and misunderstandings that have been building up for years. His marriage is still rocky, but they're working on it with their own counselor. His wife has made genuine efforts to change her behavior, including reaching out to apologize to several people she'd alienated during the wedding planning process. Whether it's enough to save their marriage remains to be seen. I've been focusing on my own life and business, using the experience as motivation to establish better boundaries in all my relationships. The money I spent on the wedding is gone, but the lessons I learned about standing up for myself have been invaluable. The wedding venue, incidentally, was very understanding about the whole situation. Marcus called me a few days later to check in and said they'd dealt with similar family drama before. They didn't charge any additional cancellation fees and even sent me a partial refund for services that hadn't been fully rendered. Some of the wedding guests have reached out over the months to share their perspectives on what happened. A surprising number of them said they'd been uncomfortable with how I'd been treated that night and were glad someone had finally stood up to the bride's increasingly demanding behavior throughout the planning process. My brother's college roommate told me that several people had commented on the seating arrangement before the reception was shut down, with multiple guests asking why I wasn't sitting with family. Apparently, the whole situation had been more obvious to others than I'd realized. Looking back, I don't regret my decision to cancel the payment, though I do wish I'd handled it differently. Maybe I should have confronted the situation directly instead of letting my hurt feelings drive me to such a dramatic response. But sometimes people need to face real consequences for their actions before they understand the impact of their behavior. The relationship with my brother will never be exactly what it was before, but in some ways, it's healthier now. We're both more honest about our expectations and boundaries, and we're working on building something more equitable than the dynamic we'd fallen into after our parents' deaths. As for his wife, time will tell whether her changes are genuine or just temporary damage control. I hope for my brother's sake that she's serious about becoming a better person, but I'm not holding my breath. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who take us for granted the most. Family relationships require the same respect and consideration as any other relationship, and being related doesn't give anyone the right to treat you poorly. I still get invitations to family events, though they're more carefully worded now and always include explicit assurances about seating arrangements and roles in the festivities. It's become something of a running joke, but I appreciate the effort to make sure I feel welcomed and valued. The business is doing well, and I've been more selective about who I help financially. I still believe in supporting family, but I've learned the importance of clear expectations and boundaries around that support. Would I do it again? Honestly, probably. Not because I enjoyed causing chaos or hurting people, but because sometimes dramatic action is the only thing that gets people's attention and forces them to examine their behavior. The nuclear option isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's the only option that works. The wedding industry, I learned, deals with family drama constantly. The vendors I've spoken with since then have shared stories that make my situation look relatively tame. Apparently, financial disputes and family feuds are more common than people realize when it comes to weddings. One thing I've noticed is how differently people react to the story depending on their own family dynamics. People who've been taken advantage of by family members tend to be more supportive of my actions, while those who've never experienced that kind of situation are more critical. Either way, I've made peace with my decision. The reception may have been ruined, but the marriage was already heading for trouble based on the foundation it was built on. My actions just brought the underlying problems to the surface more quickly than they might have emerged otherwise. 3 months later, I can honestly say I sleep better at night knowing I stood up for myself, even if the method was unconventional. Sometimes you have to be willing to burn bridges to stop people from walking all over you. And sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen.